Man taxes are almost here. Listen up because this one hits different. And if you stick with me through the whole thing, you are going to see exactly why the game has changed for good and why walking away is no longer optional. But the only move that still makes sense in a world that has decided men are the problem that needs fixing at every level. Stores across the country are rolling out digital price tags that let companies watch your face, track your phone, and then decide on the spot how much you're going to pay for a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk. And the most shocking part is that this system is being built to make men pay more simply because they are men, while the same companies bend over backwards to make things easier for women under the excuse of fixing some imaginary imbalance. That is not some wild theory. That is the direction we are already headed. And once the full rollout hits Walmart and every other major chain by the end of 2026, the everyday reality of shopping is going to feel like a quiet tax on being a man who refuses to play along with the script society has written for us. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to see more of this straight talk that cuts through the noise, then show some support by buying me a Red Bull with a one time gift or setting up a monthly pledge using the link in the description of the video. It keeps the engine running and lets me keep bringing you the unfiltered truth without holding back. Now, let us get into the meat of what is happening because this is not just about groceries or some fancy new shelf labels. This is about the slow tightening of control over every part of daily life and the way private companies are stepping in, where governments used to hesitate, turning ordinary transactions into tools for shaping behavior and deciding who gets to live comfortably and who gets squeezed. Picture walking into your local Walmart or Kroger and instead of fixed prices on the shelves, you have electronic tags that update in real time based on demand, but also based on who you are as a person. The system scans your face or pings your phone, and suddenly the algorithm knows your income level, your past purchases, your gender, your age, and even your recent online activity pulled from data brokers that have been collecting information on you for years. What used to be a simple price tag becomes a personalized calculation that can surge the cost during busy hours or drop it for certain customers while raising it for others. And the companies are selling this as efficiency and fairness, when in reality, it opens the door to charging men more because data shows they might tolerate it, or because some executive somewhere decided that equalizing outcomes means making men subsidize everyone else. We have already seen hints of this in ride sharing apps, where women can request women only drivers, or women drivers can choose to only pick up women, all under the banner of safety. And if anyone tried to set up the same system for men, it would get shut down fast. But when the squeeze is on men, the courts and the culture look the other way because somehow it is always okay to balance the scales on the backs of guys who just want to buy their food and go home without a lecture. This digital pricing setup is not some distant future experiment. It is rolling out right now, with Walmart planning full deployment across thousands of stores by the end of 2026. And Kroger has been testing similar systems for years. So the infrastructure is already in place, waiting for the green light to go live everywhere. Think about what that means for a regular guy trying to stretch his paycheck. The algorithm might see your face, recognize you as a single man in a certain age bracket with steady income, and decide you can afford an extra 10 or 15% on staples during peak shopping times, while a woman in the same store gets a lower rate because the system is programmed to address what they call the pink tax by quietly shifting costs elsewhere. It sounds outrageous when you say it out loud, but the data brokers feeding these systems already sell detailed profiles that include gender specific spending habits, and companies have every incentive to use that information to maximize profits while appearing socially responsible. We are moving toward a world where your gender becomes a pricing factor, just like the time of day or the weather. And the justification will always circle back to making things more equal for women who have been told for years that they are disadvantaged in every transaction, even when the numbers do not always support it. The hard truth is that once companies can tie your identity to every purchase, they gain the power to discriminate without ever admitting it openly. And men are the easiest target because pushing back against it gets labeled as toxic or entitled, while the same behavior aimed at women would spark immediate outrage and lawsuits. Let me lay it out even clearer because this is the part that should make every man sit up and pay attention. The same companies rolling out these digital tags are already experimenting with ways to link your shopping behavior to broader data sets that include your credit history, your social media activity, and even your compliance with certain cultural expectations. If you have ever posted something online that does not line up with the approved narrative, or if your spending patterns show you living below your means as a single guy, the system could flag you as someone who can handle a higher price or who needs to be nudged toward different choices. We have seen previews of this in other industries where algorithms decide who gets approved for loans or insurance based on everything from your zip code to your friend network. And now that same logic is coming to the grocery aisle. The sobering part is that this is not being done in secret boardrooms anymore. It is happening in plain sight, with executives talking about personalized pricing as the next big innovation, while regulators give it a pass because it promises to solve problems like inflation or inequality. But the reality is that it creates a new layer of control where your ability to afford basic necessities depends on how well you fit the profile the algorithm likes. And for men who choose to stay single, live frugally, and avoid the traps of modern relationships, that profile often marks them as someone who can be charged more to help balance the books for others. This ties directly into the bigger picture of how society is restructuring itself around the idea that men need to be managed and redirected because their natural tendencies toward independence and self reliance are now seen as threats to the collective good. Women have been encouraged for decades to pursue careers, delay family, and expect the world to adjust to their choices. And when those choices lead to financial strain or loneliness, the response is not to encourage personal responsibility, but to find ways to redistribute costs onto men, whether through higher prices, targeted policies, or cultural pressure. The digital price tags are just one tool in that toolkit, but they are a powerful one because they operate invisibly, turning every shopping trip into a quiet transaction where your gender might cost you extra without you even knowing it at first. Imagine a single man walking in to grab essentials after a long work week, and the system sees his data profile notes that he is not supporting a family or contributing to certain social programs and quietly adds a premium because the company has decided that single men have more disposable income or because it helps offset losses from other customer segments. Meanwhile, a woman in the same aisle might get a discount or standard rate because the algorithm is tuned to make her experience feel fairer, addressing the so called pink tax that has been hyped for years, even though studies show mixed results on whether women actually pay more for similar products across the board. The double standard is glaring, and it is only going to get worse as these systems become more sophisticated and integrated with facial recognition and phone tracking that let companies build detailed behavioral maps of every customer. But what makes this even more concerning is the way it connects to broader efforts to gate access to everything from the internet to commerce using biometrics and digital identification, all sold to the public as necessary protections for children or for safety. The pitch is always the same. We need to verify who you are to keep bad actors out. But the end result is a system where your ability to buy, sell, communicate, or even travel can be restricted based on your compliance score, whether that comes from a government program or a private company partnership. If you say the wrong thing online or live your life in a way that does not align with the current cultural priorities, your digital footprint could lead to higher prices, restricted access, or outright denial of service. And once that infrastructure is in place, it becomes very hard to opt out without making life extremely difficult. Men who choose to walk away from the dating scene and the expectations of traditional provider roles are already being painted as problematic. And these new pricing and tracking systems give companies and institutions another lever to make independence more expensive or inconvenient. The goal seems to be to nudge people back into the fold, encourage marriage family formation and consumption patterns that support the current economic and social structure, and anyone who resists gets the slow squeeze, whether through their wallet, their access, or their opportunities. Think about how this plays out in real terms for a guy who has decided to live below his means, save aggressively, and enjoy his own company without the complications of modern relationships. He walks into the store, his phone pings the system, or the cameras scan his face, and the algorithm cross references his data with everything from his purchase history to public records, and decides that because he is single and male, he can absorb a surge price on meat or dairy while the family shopper or the woman buying similar items gets a break. It might start small, just a few cents here and there, but over time it adds up and it sends a clear message that your lifestyle choice is not just tolerated, but penalized in subtle ways. This is the raw reality of surveillance pricing. It is not neutral. It is designed to influence behavior. And when combined with data from brokers that track everything from your browsing habits to your relationship status, it creates a feedback loop that rewards conformity and punishes those who step outside the lines. Women who find themselves in financial trouble after years of prioritizing career and independence are often met with sympathy and calls for systemic changes that shift burdens elsewhere, while men making similar independent choices are expected to suck it up and pay more because the narrative says they have it easier overall. The truth is that both sides face real pressures from rising costs and economic shifts, but the response has been to frame men as the ones who need to give more, rather than encouraging everyone to take responsibility for their decisions. This pattern did not appear overnight. It has been building for years through policies and cultural shifts that prioritize certain outcomes over individual freedom. And now technology is giving those ideas the enforcement power they always lacked. Ride sharing apps already offer gender specific options for women that would never be allowed if reversed. And the same logic is creeping into retail, where private companies can implement what amounts to a soft man tax without facing the same legal pushback. If women were suddenly charged more for groceries based on their gender, it would spark immediate outrage and likely court challenges. But when the burden lands on men, the conversation shifts to fairness or equity, and the system rolls forward. That double standard is what makes this so sobering, because it reveals how deeply the culture has accepted the idea that men are resources to be managed rather than individuals with their own legitimate needs and preferences. Men are responding by walking away, not out of spite, but out of simple self preservation, recognizing that the game is rigged in ways that make traditional participation less rewarding and more costly. They are choosing solitude, comfort, and financial discipline over relationships that often come with unspoken expectations of endless provision and emotional labor, while the world around them grows more expensive and controlling. The rise of these digital systems also ties into the way information and communication are being locked down under similar pretexts of protection and safety. We are told that biometrics and digital IDs are needed to shield children from online dangers, but the real effect is to make anonymous interaction harder and to link every online action to a verifiable identity that can be monitored and restricted. Once your face or your phone becomes the key to accessing services, the ability to speak freely or live privately shrinks dramatically because every purchase, every search, and every comment can be tied back to you and used to adjust your access or your costs. If you express views that challenge the dominant narrative on gender roles, family, or economics, the data trail could lead to higher prices at the store or limits on what you can buy, and the companies involved will claim it is just good business or risk management. This creates a chilling effect where people start to self censor, not just in public, but in their own thoughts, because the consequences of stepping out of line become too real and too immediate. Speech and thought are connected in ways that are hard to untangle. And when the penalty for certain words is a tighter squeeze on your daily life, many will choose silence and compliance over the risk of standing out. That is the quiet mechanism of control that is being built around us. And men who value their autonomy are feeling it first because their choice to opt out of the script makes them visible targets for these nudges. Women simps and older generations played a big role in voting for and supporting the policies that opened the door to this level of oversight. And now the consequences are landing on everyone, but especially on men who are expected to keep the system afloat while receiving less in return. The cost of living has risen sharply with inflation eating into paychecks, and women who bought into the idea of total independence are finding themselves stretched thin without the safety net of traditional partnerships. Instead of rethinking those choices, the response has often been to double down and look for ways to make men cover the gap, whether through higher taxes, targeted pricing, or social pressure to step up as providers, even when the relationship dynamics have shifted. Men see this clearly, and many are choosing to live their best lives on their own terms, keeping expenses low, enjoying simple comforts, and watching the broader chaos from a distance rather than diving into situations that feel like a bad deal. They are not angry in the destructive sense. They are clear eyed about the math and the risks, recognizing that solitude offers more peace and financial stability than the alternative in a world that treats male independence as a problem to solve. The digital price tags are just a visible tip of a much larger shift toward algorithmic governance of, of daily life, where your data profile determines your reality in ways that feel impersonal but are deeply personal in their impact. Companies like Walmart and Kroger are not acting in a vacuum. They are responding to economic pressures and regulatory environments that reward data driven decision making and personalized experiences, even when those experiences come at the cost of fairness for certain groups. The facial recognition capabilities built into some of these shelf systems, as highlighted in public letters from politicians, show that the hardware is ready to do more than just change prices. It can identify customers and adjust offerings on the fly based on who is standing in the aisle. That level of surveillance turns shopping from a neutral transaction into a data collection event that feeds larger profiles used for everything from marketing to potential behavioral scoring. For men who have stepped back from dating and family formation, the profile might flag them as lower priority or higher risk, leading to adjustments that make their daily costs creep upward, while others receive incentives to participate in the preferred social model. It is a soft form of social engineering delivered through the checkout line. And it works because most people will not notice the small differences until they add up over months and years. This is why the wake up call matters so much right now, because the rollout is accelerating. And once these systems are fully embedded, it will take real effort to push back or opt out effectively. Men who have already started living below their means, cutting unnecessary expenses, and focusing on self reliance are in a stronger position to weather this because they are not locked into high consumption patterns or relationships that demand constant financial output. They can adjust their shopping habits, avoid peak times, or find alternative sources for goods while the system tries to extract more from them. The broader society, on the other hand, is doubling down on models that assume men will always be there to balance the equation. And when that assumption meets the reality of men walking away, the tension only grows, leading to more creative ways to bring them back in line. The truthful assessment is that this is not sustainable in the long run because human nature does not bend forever to artificial pressures, and eventually the costs of control will outweigh the benefits, even for the institutions pushing them. In the meantime, the smart play for any man paying attention is to stay aware, minimize his exposure to these tracking systems, and continue building a life that does not depend on the approval or the pricing decisions of algorithms tuned against his interests. The connection between these pricing changes and the larger cultural story is impossible to ignore because both stem from the same root idea that traditional male roles need to be reformed or supplemented by external forces to achieve desired outcomes for everyone else. Women hitting financial walls after years of prioritizing other goals are part of the picture, as are the men who have decided that the risks of engagement outweigh the rewards in a landscape where expectations are high but reciprocity feels low. The digital systems add another layer by making it possible to penalize the men who opt out while trying to support the women who are struggling with the consequences of their choices. It is raw and it is straightforward, but it is also the truth that more people need to face if they want to navigate the coming years without getting caught in the squeeze. Living as a single man with discipline and awareness is not a retreat, it is a rational response to a world that has made independence more viable than ever for those willing to embrace it fully. As these technologies spread, the potential for abuse grows because once companies have the power to vary prices based on personal data, the temptation to use that power for social or political ends becomes very real. We have seen data used in other contexts to influence elections, shape public opinion, and enforce compliance with health or environmental policies. And there is no reason to believe retail will remain untouched by the same impulses. A man whose data shows he lives a traditional or conservative lifestyle might face higher costs or fewer discounts compared to someone whose profile aligns with progressive values. And the company can always hide behind the language of risk assessment or customer segmentation. The sobering part is how quietly this can happen without widespread outrage because the changes are incremental and personalized, making it hard for any one person to prove discrimination, even when the pattern is clear across thousands of transactions. Men are particularly vulnerable here because the culture has spent years framing their concerns as privilege or backlash rather than legitimate observations about fairness. And that framing makes it easier for these systems to take root without strong resistance. The response from men has been predictable. To anyone paying attention, a steady movement towards self focused living, where relationships are optional luxuries rather than necessities, and where financial security comes from discipline rather than dual incomes or societal approval. They are not hiding in basements or raging online. They are simply choosing paths that offer better returns on their time and energy, avoiding the pitfalls of modern dating where the deck often feels stacked and the rewards uncertain. This walking away is accelerated by the very systems that try to pull them back in because each new layer of control or cost makes the independent path look even more attractive by comparison. Women expressing loneliness or frustration in their 30s and 40s are part of the same story, realizing too late that the independence they chased came with trade offs that no amount of policy or pricing adjustment can fully erase. The truthful take is that both sides are dealing with the fallout of cultural shifts that promised freedom but delivered isolation and economic pressure, and the digital pricing revolution is just the latest chapter in that unfolding reality. Technology, like electronic shelf labels, does bring some conveniences such as faster inventory management and potentially lower operational costs for stores, but those benefits are overshadowed by the loss of transparency and the introduction of hidden variables that customers cannot easily control or even understand. When prices can change based on who is looking at the tag, the old assumption of a fair market price for everyone disappears. And in its place comes a negotiated reality where your personal data becomes currency that the store spends to maximize its margins. For a straightforward guy who just wants to buy what he needs and leave without drama, this feels like an unnecessary complication that adds mental load to an already stressful part of life. The raw truth is that we are trading simplicity and predictability for sophistication and surveillance, and the average man is expected to accept it as progress while bearing a disproportionate share of the adjustment costs. That is not a conspiracy, it is the logical outcome of incentives that reward data collection and behavioral influence over neutral service, and it is happening in plain sight across the retail landscape. The integration of phone tracking and facial scans adds another dimension because it allows the system to build real time profiles that go beyond basic demographics into predictive modeling of your future behavior and spending capacity. If the algorithm decides that single men in your age group are likely to cut back on spending during economic uncertainty, it might preemptively raise prices to capture more revenue now, or it might offer targeted discounts to certain other groups to maintain overall sales volume. Either way, the decision is made without your input and without clear disclosure, making it feel like the store is playing a game where only one side knows the rules. This is the wake up call that more men need to hear before the full system goes live, because once it is everywhere, the options for avoidance become limited, and the habit of paying attention to these details will separate those who thrive from those who get slowly ground down by cumulative small increases. Living with eyes open means recognizing these shifts for what they are: tools of control wrapped in the language of convenience and efficiency, and adjusting your habits accordingly to protect your resources and your peace of mind. The broader societal impact is that trust in institutions and companies erodes when people sense that every interaction is being gamed for someone else's benefit. Men who have already distanced themselves from certain expectations are less surprised by these developments because they have seen the pattern in other areas of life where the rules seem to bend depending on who is involved. The straightforward reality is that power structures, whether corporate or cultural, tend to protect their own interests. And right now, those interests align with managing male behavior more closely while offering support to other groups under the banner of equity. This does not require grand conspiracies, just ordinary human incentives playing out at scale with advanced technology, making the management easier and more precise than ever before. The result is a world where independence for men comes with extra friction, and the path of least resistance is to conform, even when that conformity feels hollow or unsustainable over time. As the rollout continues, we can expect more stories of customers noticing price differences that seem tied to personal factors rather than pure supply and demand. And the companies will respond with explanations about dynamic pricing or customer loyalty programs that sound reasonable on the surface, but fail to address the underlying data driven discrimination. For men paying attention, the best strategy is to minimize data exposure where possible, shop at smaller independent stores when feasible, use cash or privacy tools, and maintain the discipline of living below their means so that small price hikes do not derail their overall plan. This is not paranoia. It is practical adaptation to a changing environment where the old assumptions about fair pricing no longer hold, and where self reliance becomes the most reliable form of protection. The sobering truth is that society is moving toward greater control and visibility in every transaction, and men who value their freedom are the ones who will feel the pressure first and respond by doubling down on the choices that keep them outside the main current of dependency and obligation. The stories of women facing financial hardship after embracing full independence add another layer to this picture because they highlight the human cost of the cultural messages that downplayed the value of stable partnerships and mutual support. Many women in their 30s and beyond are expressing a deep sense of loneliness and frustration, realizing that the career focused life left gaps that career success alone cannot fill. And the response from some quarters is to call for more systemic changes that indirectly ask men to fill those gaps without addressing the root causes of the mismatch. Men see this and choose to protect their own energy and resources rather than stepping into roles that feel like rescue missions with little gratitude or reciprocity in return. The digital pricing systems fit into this dynamic by creating another avenue for resource transfer that operates quietly and automatically, making it harder for individuals to opt out or even recognize what is happening until the effects accumulate. It is a raw deal for men who have done nothing wrong except choose a path of self determination in a time when that choice is increasingly viewed as antisocial or problematic. Technology companies and retailers are not villains in some cartoon sense. They are responding to market forces and regulatory signals that reward data rich environments and personalized services. But the aggregate effect on individual freedom is still negative when those services come with hidden cost to autonomy and fairness. The authoritative take here is that we should not celebrate the innovation without scrutinizing the trade offs. And right now, the trade offs are tilting heavily toward greater surveillance and behavioral control, with men bearing a visible portion of the burden. The wake up call is to stop assuming that these changes are neutral or inevitable in a positive way, and start treating them as signals that personal vigilance and strategic living are more important than ever. Men who have embraced the walkaway lifestyle are already practicing this vigilance by reducing dependencies, keeping their profiles low, and focusing on controllable aspects of their lives rather than fighting unwinnable battles against corporate algorithms or cultural tides. This shift towards surveillance pricing is part of a larger pattern where everyday activities become data points in a vast network that influences not just what you pay, but what opportunities come your way in other areas of life. Credit scores, insurance rates, job prospects, and even social interactions are increasingly shaped by similar data ecosystems. And the grocery store is simply the latest frontier where that logic is being applied with visible hardware that makes the process feel almost mundane. For a man sitting at the bar reflecting on his week, this should spark a clear headed assessment of where he stands and how he can maintain his edge in a system that seems designed to extract more from those who refuse to follow the crowd. The truthful answer is that walking away is not giving up. It is refusing to subsidize a structure that no longer serves your interests and building something quieter and more sustainable in its place. As more men make that choice, the pressure on the system increases, but so does the freedom for those who step outside it and learn to thrive on their own terms. The integration of these technologies with existing data brokerage markets means that your shopping habits can be sold and resold to other companies, governments, or third parties, creating a web of information that follows you across contexts and makes true privacy a relic of the past. A single trip to the store could contribute to a profile that affects your rates for everything from car insurance to online subscriptions if the data is shared or aggregated in certain ways. And the average person has little say in how that information is used once it leaves the store. Men who live simply and avoid debt are less vulnerable to some of these effects, but they still face the daily reality of potentially higher costs based on gender or lifestyle markers that the algorithm flags as less desirable. This is the raw edge of modern life, where technology promises convenience but delivers a constant low level negotiation with unseen forces that have their own priorities and bottom lines. The sobering realization is that fighting this head on is less effective than adapting around it by reducing your footprint, minimizing track transactions, and maintaining the mental clarity that comes from not being overly dependent on any single system or institution. Women who are now vocal about their struggles with loneliness and financial stability are living proof that the promises of complete independence did not deliver the fulfillment that was advertised and instead created new dependencies on systems that are themselves under strain. The call for men to re engage or to accept higher costs as a form of equity ignores the fact that many men have already calculated the risks and found the traditional path wanting, especially when the culture surrounding it has shifted toward blame and expectation rather than mutual respect and shared goals. The digital price tags and the surveillance they enable are symptoms of a deeper imbalance where the response to female hardship is to adjust the environment rather than encourage adaptation. And the same adjustment often lands as an extra burden on men who are simply trying to hold their own ground. This is not about assigning fault to one side or the other, but about facing the straightforward truth that when incentives are misaligned, the outcomes will reflect that misalignment until people start making different choices on a large scale. The rollout of electronic shelf labels across major chains is happening on a timeline that gives people a narrow window to prepare and adjust their habits before the full effects become normalized and invisible. By the end of 2026, the system will be standard in thousands of locations, and the generation growing up with it will see dynamic personalized pricing as normal rather than a novel intrusion. For men in their 20s, 30s, and beyond who are paying attention, this is the moment to double down on financial discipline, learn the patterns of the new systems, and position themselves to minimize the impact on their wallets and their peace. It means shopping strategically, avoiding loyalty programs that feed more data into the machine, and keeping a close eye on how prices fluctuate in relation to personal factors that can be controlled or obscured. It is not about paranoia, but about clear eyed realism in an environment that rewards awareness and punishes complacency. And the men who have already embraced the walk away philosophy are better positioned than most to navigate it successfully because they have practice in putting their own interests first without apology. The connection to age verification and internet control is worth noting here because the same logic of protection and safety is used to justify both the pricing systems and the push for biometric gates online. And the end result in both cases is less anonymity and more traceable behavior that can be rewarded or penalized. If you need to verify your identity to access certain sites or services, the data trail grows longer and the ability to live privately shrinks. And that same identity can then influence your offline experiences, including what you pay at the store. The companies and governments involved will always frame it as necessary progress, but the cumulative effect is a society where deviation from the norm becomes more difficult and more expensive. Men who value free thought and independent living are right to see this as a warning sign and to respond by limiting their exposure where possible and strengthening the internal resources that cannot be tracked or taxed in the same way. This is the authoritative truth of the moment we are living in a tightening net of data and control that presents itself as helpful while quietly reshaping the incentives for how we live and interact. As the conversation around these changes grows, it is important to keep the focus on observable facts rather than emotional appeals or partisan blame games because the technology itself is neutral, but the uses to which it is put reflect the priorities of those who control it. Right now, those priorities include managing economic pressures through personalized pricing and addressing social imbalances through subtle redistributions that often target men as the default payers. The raw reality is that this approach may provide short term relief for some groups, but it risks long term resentment and disengagement from the very men whose participation has historically kept the system running smoothly. When men walk away in large numbers, whether from dating from high consumption or from traditional roles, the ripple effects are felt across the economy and the culture. And the introduction of tools like surge pricing and surveillance tags is in part a response to that disengagement, an attempt to recapture revenue and influence through technology rather than through voluntary participation. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why the changes feel personal even when they are presented as general business innovations, and it underscores the importance of maintaining clear boundaries and strong personal discipline in response. The stories of broke women scrambling for stability after the collapse of easy money eras or high flying careers serve as cautionary tales that parallel the broader economic shifts affecting everyone but hitting certain groups harder due to lifestyle choices and cultural messaging. Men who avoided those traps by staying single, living lean, and focusing on controllable outcomes are not gloating. They are simply reaping the benefits of decisions that prioritize long term stability over short term validation. The digital pricing revolution adds a new variable to that equation by potentially increasing the cost of even basic stability for those who do not fit the preferred customer profile. And that is why awareness and adaptation are essential. It is not about hating the system or the people running it, but about recognizing that the system has its own logic, and that logic does not always align with the interests of independent men who want to live on their own terms without subsidizing outcomes they did not choose. The straightforward path forward is to keep building the kind of life that is resilient to these pressures through saving skills, community where possible, and a mindset that refuses to be defined by external pricing or approval. The truth is uncomfortable, but facing it directly is the only way to respond effectively rather than drifting along with the current and waking up later to find the options have narrowed. Men who have chosen to walk away are not running from responsibility. They are exercising it in the most personal way by taking control of their own resources, time, and energy in a world that increasingly tries to direct those things toward collective goals that may not serve them. As the systems roll out further, the divide between those who see the game and those who do not will become more pronounced, and the ones who see it clearly will be the ones who maintain their freedom and their sanity in the face of increasing complexity and oversight. The wake up call is here, and it is delivered not with anger, but with the calm authority of someone who has looked at the facts and decided that self preservation through awareness is the sanest response available. Continuing directly from there, The expansion of these digital systems will likely include more integration with loyalty apps and payment methods that further tie your identity to every purchase, creating a seamless loop of data that retailers can use to refine their pricing models on a daily or even hourly basis. For the average man, this means that his routine grocery run could vary in cost based on factors he cannot see or control. And over the course of a year, those variations could represent a noticeable hit to his budget, especially if he is already living with tight margins to maintain his independence. The companies will point to efficiencies and better inventory management as the justification, but the customer experience will feel more like being constantly evaluated and charged accordingly, with little recourse if the evaluation seems unfair. This is the new normal that is being built, and recognizing it early gives men the chance to adjust their shopping strategies, perhaps by buying in bulk at fixed price outlets or focusing on non perishable goods that can be stockpiled before the full surge capabilities go live across all locations. It is practical advice born from a straightforward assessment of the incentives at play, and it aligns with the broader philosophy of reducing dependency on systems that do not have your best interests at heart. The cultural backdrop to all of this is the ongoing narrative around gender roles and economic equity that has framed men as the group with excess capacity to absorb additional costs or responsibilities without acknowledging the real strains many men face in their own lives, from work, demands, legal biases, and shifting social expectations. When digital pricing incorporates gender as a variable, even indirectly through correlated data points, it reinforces that narrative in the marketplace, making the act of buying food or household items another arena where men are expected to contribute more to the collective balance. The raw truth is that this approach ignores the diversity of individual circumstances and instead applies broad brushes that penalize men for statistical averages or for choices like staying single that are perfectly legitimate responses to the current dating and relationship landscape. Women who are dealing with their own financial and emotional challenges after years of following the independent script are often encouraged to see men as the solution rather than rethinking their own paths. And the pricing systems provide a quiet mechanism to facilitate that transfer without requiring direct conversation or accountability. Men who have walked away have already opted out of that dynamic, and the continued push toward more control only confirms that their decision was sound because it removes them from situations where their efforts are taken for granted or redirected without consent. The technical side of electronic shelf labels involves small digital displays that can be updated centrally, allowing stores to change prices across thousands of items without manual labor. And that capability is what makes dynamic pricing feasible at scale. When combined with customer tracking through phones or cameras, the store gains the ability to present different prices to different people in real time based on their profiles. And the system can even test various pricing strategies to see what maximizes revenue or foot traffic from specific demographics. For men, this could mean seeing higher prices on items that data shows they buy regularly, such as certain proteins or tools, while other groups receive promotions designed to boost their spending. The sobering implication is that shopping becomes less about value and more about negotiation with an invisible counterparty that has far more information than you do. And the only way to level the field is to reduce the amount of information you provide and the frequency with which you engage with the system. This is why the walkaway mindset extends beyond relationships into consumption habits, encouraging minimalism and self sufficiency as defenses against a marketplace that is becoming more extractive and less transparent. As more states and regulators look at these practices, the responses so far have been weak, with some requiring disclosure of dynamic pricing, but not banning the underlying data practices that enable discriminatory outcomes. This leaves the door open for continued expansion and means that men cannot rely on external protections to shield them from the effects. Instead, they must take personal responsibility for navigating the new landscape with eyes open and strategies in place. The authoritative position is that trusting the system to self correct on issues of fairness is naive when the incentives point toward greater data use and personalized extraction. And the better approach is to assume the worst case scenario of increasing costs for independent lifestyles and plan accordingly by building buffers, increasing skills, and maintaining low visibility where possible. This is not defeatism, it is realism, and it mirrors the same clear thinking that leads men to avoid entanglements in dating or family formation when the terms feel unbalanced and the risks high. The human stories behind the statistics add weight to the argument because behind every data point is a person dealing with rising costs, shrinking options, and a sense that the rules keep changing in ways that disadvantage those who play straight. Men who have chosen solitude and simplicity often report higher levels of contentment once they accept the trade offs, because the freedom from constant expectation allows for genuine relaxation and focus on personal growth rather than performance for an audience that does not reciprocate. The digital pricing push challenges even that simplicity by inserting new variables into basic survival, but it also reinforces the value of the choices they have made because a lean lifestyle is more adaptable to fluctuations than one built on dual incomes or high consumption. Women facing their own walls of loneliness and financial strain are part of the same economic reality, but their responses often involve calls for more support or adjustment from men rather than internal recalibration. And that difference in approach highlights why the systems are evolving in the direction they are to manage the resulting imbalances through technology rather than cultural honesty. The future of retail is likely to include even more advanced integrations where your digital wallet, your health data, or your social connections influence not just price, but availability of certain items or access to premium services. And the men who have stayed ahead of the curve by limiting their digital footprints will have an advantage in preserving their autonomy. This is the long game that the walk-away philosophy prepares men for a life where external systems have less hold because internal resources and discipline have been cultivated over time. The sobering wake up call is that the window for easy adaptation is closing as the hardware rolls out and the data networks expand. So the time to act is now by auditing your habits, reducing unnecessary tracking, and committing to the kind of straightforward living that does not leave you vulnerable to every new pricing algorithm or control mechanism that comes along. It is a message delivered with the calm intensity of a friend at the bar who has seen enough to know that the game has changed, and the only winning move for many is to stop playing by the old rules and start writing their own. The connection between these retail changes and the broader push for digital identification across society is clear because both rely on the same foundation of verifiable identity and behavioral data to function and both promise safety or efficiency while delivering greater oversight. When age verification or biometric logins become standard for online access, the same identity can be linked to offline activities, including shopping, and the profile that emerges can influence everything from credit offers to insurance premiums to the price of your next meal. For men who value private thought and unfiltered conversation, this represents a significant erosion of the spaces where they can speak freely without fear of repercussions in other areas of life. And the response has been to seek out alternatives or simply reduce participation in tracked platforms. The raw truth is that control follows data. And as data collection becomes more pervasive, the areas of life left untouched grow smaller, making the choice to walk away from high visibility lifestyles even more appealing for those who see the pattern early. The expansion of these retail tracking systems will bring deeper layers of behavioral prediction that go far beyond simple gender or income markers, reaching into patterns of movement, frequency of visits, and even the emotional cues picked up through advanced camera analytics that claim to read micro expressions or body language to adjust offers in the moment. A man who walks with purpose, avoids eye contact with promotional displays, or consistently chooses the cheapest options on the shelf might trigger an algorithm that labels him as price sensitive or resistant to upsells, leading to fewer discounts or targeted increases on the items he buys most often. This is not science fiction. It is the logical progression of technology already tested in pilot programs where stores measure dwell time at certain aisles and correlate it with purchase data to refine their models. For the guy who has committed to living lean and avoiding waste, this means his discipline habits could ironically cost him more because the system interprets self control as a signal to extract higher margins from those who seem least likely to complain or switch stores. The straightforward reality is that what looks like smart shopping to a clear thinking man becomes data that works against him in an environment optimized for influencing behavior toward higher spending or compliance with preferred consumer profiles that favor family units or dual income households over the single independent operator. Companies are investing heavily in these capabilities because the data goldmine they create allows for micro segmentation that boosts overall profitability, even if it creates friction for certain customer types. Imagine entering the store and the digital tags shift subtly based on aggregated profiles from your past visits combined with external data feeds showing you as a single male with stable employment but no dependents. The system might decide you represent an opportunity to capture more surplus by raising base prices on everyday staples while offering flash promotions to shoppers whose profiles indicate they respond well to emotional appeals or family oriented marketing. This creates an invisible tax that accumulates quietly over repeated trips, turning what should be a routine errand into a calculated drain on resources for men who have already optimized their lives around minimalism and self reliance. The sobering aspect is how this aligns with the broader cultural push to encourage certain lifestyles over others using economic levers rather than direct mandates, making independence feel increasingly expensive, not because of market forces alone, but because of deliberate design choices that prioritize social engineering through commerce. Men who have walked away from the expectation of constant provision are finding that even their basic maintenance now carries an extra load designed to nudge them back toward participation in structures that benefit from their labor and spending without offering proportional returns in autonomy or respect. The infrastructure supporting this shift relies on partnerships between retailers, data brokers, and tech firms that specialize in real time analytics, with Walmart leading the charge through its massive scale and existing investment in computer vision systems that can identify repeat customers without needing explicit logins. By the end of 2026, the rollout will cover virtually all major locations, meaning the default shopping experience for millions will include this layer of personalization that feels seamless to the casual observer, but loaded with implications for those paying close attention. A regular guy grabbing supplies after work might notice small discrepancies in totals over time without realizing the algorithm has been adjusting based on his phone's unique identifier or facial features matched against a growing database of customer behaviors. This is the raw edge where convenience meets control. And the men who have chosen solitude as a path to peace are the ones most likely to feel the pinch because their lower engagement with social norms makes their profiles stand out as outliers worth optimizing against. The truthful assessment is that fighting these changes through complaints or boycotts offers limited upside when the systems are backed by deep pockets and regulatory tolerance. Instead, the effective response is to adapt by diversifying sources of goods, supporting local cash based options where available, and maintaining the mental discipline that prevents small erosions from becoming major setbacks in financial independence. This development ties into the way ride sharing and delivery services have already normalized gender based preferences with options that cater specifically to women under safety pretexts, while similar accommodations for men would face immediate legal and cultural backlash, creating a precedent for differential treatment that now extends into physical retail spaces. If a woman can select a female driver for comfort, the same logic applied to pricing in stores could justify adjustments that favor female shoppers by shifting costs toward male customers, framed as addressing historical imbalances or promoting equity in outcomes. The double standard is evident, and it reveals a deeper societal acceptance that certain groups can receive preferential handling without it being labeled discrimination, while the reverse is treated as unacceptable. For men navigating this landscape, the clear headed choice is to recognize the pattern and reduce reliance on platforms or stores that embed these biases into their operations, choosing instead routes that preserve neutrality and predictability in transactions. This is not about resentment. It is about practical boundary setting in a world where the rules are applied unevenly. And technology amplifies the unevenness by making discrimination scalable and deniable at the same time. The economic calculations behind these systems are straightforward when viewed through the lens of profit maximization. Retailers face rising operational costs from labor inflation and supply chain pressures, so they turn to data driven tools that allow them to capture more consumer surplus from segments perceived as having higher tolerance or ability to pay. Single men without family obligations often fit that profile in the models because aggregate data shows they spend on certain categories without the same budget constraints of households stretching every dollar across multiple needs. The result is a quiet reallocation where the independent man subsidizes lower prices or promotions for other groups, helping to maintain overall sales volume and customer satisfaction scores that keep the business healthy. This is capitalism at work, but twisted by the injection of social priorities that treat gender as a valid pricing variable, much like age or location, but with far less transparency and accountability. The wake up call for men is to stop assuming the market will remain neutral and start treating every major retailer as an entity with its own agenda that may not align with personal goals of simplicity and self sufficiency. By living below their means and building reserves, these men create buffers that absorb the extra costs without derailing their overall trajectory toward freedom from obligation. Broader societal responses to these changes have been muted so far, with public discourse focusing more on the convenience of digital tags or the potential for better stock management rather than the privacy and fairness implications that should raise red flags for anyone valuing individual agency. Politicians have sent letters questioning the use of facial recognition in pricing, but the responses from companies emphasize voluntary participation and customer benefits, leaving the core capabilities intact and ready for wider deployment. This gap between concern and action allows the systems to mature under the radar, turning what could have been a debate about limits into an acceptance of the new status quo. Men who have distanced themselves from mainstream expectations are less surprised by this because they have witnessed similar patterns in other domains where cultural priorities override concerns about equal treatment or personal privacy. The authoritative truth is that waiting for external correction is a losing strategy. When the momentum favors data collection and behavioral influence, the smarter path is internal fortification through awareness, reduced exposure, and continued commitment to lifestyles that minimize vulnerability to algorithmic adjustments. The long term projection for this trend points toward a retail environment where prices are as fluid as stock market quotes changing, not just by time or demand, but by the complete digital shadow cast by each customer. Your history of returns, your browsing patterns linked through loyalty accounts, and even correlations with public records could feed into a score that determines whether you see standard rates or adjusted ones designed to test the upper limit of what you will accept. For the man who has embraced walking away, this means his choice to avoid debt, avoid excess, and avoid entanglements becomes data that flags him for closer extraction because the system sees untapped potential in his stability. The sobering reality is that independence carries a premium in this setup where the cost of opting out includes higher friction in basic commerce, making the disciplined life both a shield and a target at the same time. Responding effectively requires a mindset shift toward viewing consumption as a tactical exercise rather than a default activity, buying what is truly necessary in ways that limit data generation and seeking out alternatives that operate on fixed, transparent terms whenever possible. This approach keeps the focus on controllable factors and prevents the slow creep of costs from undermining the peace that comes from living on your own terms. The integration with larger digital identity initiatives adds another dimension because the push for biometric verification online and in financial services creates a unified profile that retailers can tap into for even more precise personalization. If accessing certain websites or services requires facial scans or government issued digital credentials, the same verification can streamline in store tracking, making anonymous shopping harder and linking your retail behavior to your broader digital life. This convergence means that expressing certain ideas online or maintaining a low profile in social matters could indirectly influence your shopping costs if algorithms draw connections between compliance and risk profiles. Men who value straightforward speech and unfiltered thinking are particularly exposed here because their reluctance to self censor for approval puts them at odds with systems that reward alignment with dominant narratives. The raw truth is that this creates pressure to conform, not through laws, but through convenience and cost making silence or careful wording the default for those who want to avoid the extra toll on their daily budget. Walking away extends to digital habits as well by limiting engagement with tracked platforms and favoring direct real world interactions that leave less of a permanent record. Economic pressures from inflation and shifting job markets have left many women in precarious positions after pursuing paths that emphasize career and autonomy over earlier family formation. And the response has often been to advocate for adjustments that redistribute resources rather than revisiting the choices themselves. This dynamic plays out in retail through pricing models that can quietly favor segments experiencing hardship while shifting burdens toward those seen as more resilient or less vocal about increases. Men who have calculated the costs of traditional roles and found them wanting are unwilling to absorb those shifts indefinitely, choosing instead to protect their earnings for their own stability and future security. The truthful observation is that both genders face real challenges in the current environment, but the cultural framing tends to cast male independence as a failure to support rather than a legitimate pursuit of balance, and the digital systems operationalize that framing by embedding it into everyday transactions. The wake up call here is to recognize that personal responsibility cuts both ways, and expecting one group to endlessly balance the scales ignores the human tendency towards self preservation when the deal feels consistently one sided. The storytelling element of this shift comes through in the everyday experiences of men noticing anomalies in their receipts or sensing that their shopping trips take on a different tone under the new systems. One guy might realize his regular protein purchases cost more on days when the store is less crowded, while another sees promotions bypass his cart entirely because his profile does not match the target for family meal deals. These small moments accumulate into a larger awareness that the store is no longer a neutral space, but an active participant in shaping customer behavior through invisible levers. For men committed to the walkaway path, these moments reinforce the decision to keep life simple by stocking up strategically, avoiding impulse buys, and treating the retail environment as a necessary evil rather than a destination. The authoritative but relaxed take is that adapting does not require rage or rebellion. It requires quiet competence in managing your resources so that external pressures cannot dictate your peace or your progress. By sharing these observations in honest conversation, the picture becomes clearer and more men can prepare without falling into the trap of denial or overreaction. The technological backbone involves sophisticated algorithms trained on vast data sets that include not only purchase history, but also movement patterns within the store and cross referenced information from partner companies, creating a three-dimensional view of each shopper. This allows for predictive pricing, where the system anticipates your needs based on past behavior and sets rates accordingly, sometimes higher to capture urgency or lower to encourage volume from other segments. A single man who buys consistently but minimally might see his per item cost rise because the model determines he is not a high volume spender worth incentivizing compared to households that clear entire aisles. This is the raw mechanics at work, turning shopping into a game of cat and mouse where the house holds most of the cards, and the player must learn to minimize losses through strategy and restraint. Men who have practiced living below their means already have the discipline required to navigate this effectively by questioning every purchase, weighing alternatives, and refusing to let small algorithmic nudges derail their overall financial plan. The sobering truth is that technology accelerates existing tendencies, and in this case, it accelerates the tendency to treat certain customers as adjustable variables rather than equal participants in a fair exchange. Regulatory environments in different states vary, but the general trend is toward light touch oversight that requires notice of dynamic pricing without prohibiting the use of personal data for differentiation. This leaves ample room for innovation and surveillance while providing cover for companies to claim transparency, even as the full scope of profiling remains opaque to the average customer. For men paying attention, this means the burden of vigilance falls on the individual rather than on distant authorities who may have their own incentives aligned with data driven governance. The clear response is to assume that privacy is compromised by default in these environments and to act accordingly by using cash where feasible, avoiding apps that link purchases to identities, and diversifying shopping locations to prevent any single profile from becoming too detailed or actionable. This practical approach aligns with the broader philosophy of self reliance that has guided many men toward simpler lives free from the complications of mismatched expectations in relationships or society at large. The cultural narrative surrounding these changes often emphasizes empowerment through technology or solutions to inequality without addressing how the same tools can entrench new forms of uneven treatment. When gender or lifestyle factors influence pricing under the banner of equity, the underlying assumption is that certain groups owe adjustments to others based on aggregate statistics rather than individual merit or choice. Men who have opted for solitude and financial discipline challenge that assumption by demonstrating that personal outcomes can be managed effectively without relying on or subsidizing external structures, and the systems respond by increasing the cost of that demonstration. The wake up call is direct. The game has layers of adjustment built in to maintain balance on terms set by those who control the infrastructure. And recognizing this early allows for strategic positioning that preserves autonomy without direct confrontation. Storytelling through these examples helps illustrate the point without needing personal anecdotes. The pattern itself tells a compelling tale of incentives meeting technology in ways that reshape daily reality for those caught in the flow. As the systems mature, we can expect integration with delivery services and online ordering, where the same profiling applies to virtual carts, adjusting totals based on account data or linked devices before the order even ships. This extends the reach of personalized pricing beyond the physical store into the home, making it harder to escape the effects unless one deliberately limits digital engagement. For the man living a quiet life of comfort and control, this means auditing online habits as carefully as in store ones, choosing sellers with fixed pricing or bulk options that reduce the frequency of interactions with adaptive systems. The authoritative position is that freedom today requires deliberate limitation of exposure rather than passive acceptance of default settings pushed by corporations with scale and data advantages. Men who have walked away from high maintenance relationships understand this principle intuitively. Applying the same logic to consumption keeps their resources intact and their minds clear for the pursuits that actually matter to them. The human element in all of this is the quiet frustration of realizing that basic acts like buying food now involve unseen negotiations with algorithms that have no interest in your personal story or your reasons for choosing independence. Yet that frustration can fuel clarity rather than defeat, leading to habits that prioritize resilience and adaptability over complaint. Women dealing with their own set of economic realities after delayed family or career trade offs add complexity to the picture because their challenges are real. But the proposed solutions often circle back to expecting more from men or from systems that extract from them indirectly. The straightforward truth is that sustainable balance comes from mutual adjustment, not one sided extraction. And when technology is used to enforce the latter, the rational response for many men is continued disengagement from the cycles that demand without reciprocating. This is the sobering reality that more people are waking up to as the digital tags become standard and the data flows accelerate. The long game for retailers involves using these tools to build customer lifetime value models that predict not just current spending, but future loyalty or defection, risk adjusting prices dynamically to retain profitable segments while extracting more from those deemed stable but underutilized. A single man with steady income and low drama might score as low risk, but high potential, leading to pricing that tests his loyalty without pushing him away entirely. This sophisticated approach turns commerce into a continuous optimization problem where human preferences are inputs to be managed rather than respected as fixed. For men committed to the walkaway lifestyle, the counter is to remain unpredictable in consumption patterns, or to reduce overall engagement with the optimized systems, altogether favoring simplicity that starves the models of useful data. The raw power of this strategy lies in its quiet effectiveness. It does not challenge the system head on, but renders parts of it irrelevant to your life, allowing peace and control to emerge from reduced dependency. The connection to broader control mechanisms becomes clearer when considering how similar data practices are applied in employment credit and insurance, where profiles influence opportunities in ways that parallel retail pricing. A man whose spending data shows consistent frugality and independence might be viewed positively in some models for low risk, but negatively in others for not contributing to consumption driven growth or family formation metrics. This creates a patchwork of incentives and penalties that favor conformity to preferred social models over individual variation. The wake up call is to treat all such systems with healthy skepticism, building life structures that are anti fragile to shifts in algorithmic favor. Men who have chosen solitude and self directed living are already practicing this by focusing on skills, savings, and personal standards that do not require external validation or approval to sustain them. As the retail landscape evolves, this mindset becomes even more valuable, providing a foundation that withstands the pressures of surveillance and personalized extraction. The storytelling continues through the gradual normalization of these practices, where what once seemed like a minor convenience in a few test stores becomes the standard experience across the country, with customers adapting without much protest because the changes arrive incrementally and are wrapped in promises of better service. Yet beneath the surface, the shift represents a fundamental change in the relationship between buyer and seller, from one of mutual exchange to one of data mediated influence, where the seller holds the informational upper hand. For the clear thinking man, this normalization is a signal to stay vigilant and proactive rather than complacent, ensuring that his choices continue to serve his interests even as the environment grows more complex. The authoritative but relaxed truth, shared like conversation at the bar, is that awareness paired with disciplined action remains the most reliable path through uncertain times, allowing men to maintain their independence without being swept into cycles of obligation or resentment. This approach has served many well in relationships, and it applies equally to the marketplace, where self reliance translates into resilience against the latest waves of technological and cultural adjustment. The economic backdrop of rising costs and stagnant wages for many has amplified the impact of these pricing innovations, making even small differentials feel significant over time. Men who have kept their expenses low and avoided lifestyle inflation are better equipped to handle the variations, but they still face the cumulative effect that can erode savings if not monitored. The sobering part is that the systems are designed to exploit exactly those margins, turning discipline into a factor that justifies higher extraction because the data suggests capacity without immediate pushback. Responding with continued frugality and strategic sourcing keeps the balance in favor of the individual rather than letting the algorithm dictate the terms. This is the practical reality that underscores the value of the walk away philosophy. It prepares men for environments where participation comes with hidden costs and opting out or minimizing involvement preserves resources for what truly matters. As more data flows into these retail models, the potential for cross industry sharing increases with anonymized or aggregated profiles feeding into larger ecosystems that influence everything from advertising to policy recommendations. A man whose retail data shows consistent single household purchasing might contribute to statistics used to justify targeted taxes or programs that assume certain demographics can absorb more without complaint. This indirect loop reinforces the cycle where independent choices become data points used to manage or penalize those choices further down the line. The truthful response is to limit the data generated at the source by reducing frequency of tracked transactions and favoring methods that break the chain of identification. Men practicing this have found greater peace in simplicity, knowing that their lives are less legible to systems that might otherwise use that legibility against their interests. The wake up call remains clear. The tools of convenience are also tools of influence, and choosing how much to engage is a form of quiet power that aligns with living life on your own straightforward terms. The cultural conversation around gender and economics often overlooks the agency of individuals in favor of systemic explanations that call for more intervention rather than personal recalibration. When women express struggles with the outcomes of independence, the focus tends toward external support mechanisms, including adjustments in pricing or policy that can indirectly burden men who have made different choices. The raw observation is that true progress comes from honest assessment of trade offs on all sides rather than mechanisms that obscure those trade offs through technology. Men who have walked away have made their assessment and acted on it, choosing paths that offer better alignment with their values and realities, even if those paths carry additional friction from evolving systems. This decision is not a rejection of society, but a selective engagement that prioritizes sustainability over obligation. And as the digital pricing landscape matures, that selectivity becomes even more essential for maintaining balance. The technological evolution will likely include voice or gesture based interactions with digital tags, allowing further personalization based on additional behavioral cues collected in the moment. This adds layers of complexity to an already data rich environment, making the store experience more interactive, but also more invasive for those who prefer to move through it efficiently without broadcasting additional information. For the man focused on getting what he needs and leaving the added interaction feels like unnecessary overhead that feeds systems with little benefit in return. The straightforward strategy is to minimize such engagements by planning purchases in advance, using fixed price alternatives when available, and maintaining the calm discipline that prevents frustration from clouding judgment. This approach keeps the focus on results rather than resistance, allowing life to continue with minimal disruption from the surrounding changes. The societal impact extends to trust in commerce when customers sense that prices are no longer fixed or fair, but subject to unseen calculations based on personal profiles. The relationship with retailers shifts from reliable service to cautious navigation. Men who have experienced uneven treatment in other areas of life are quicker to recognize this shift and adjust accordingly, treating major chains as one option among many rather than the default. The authoritative truth is that diversified habits and reduced dependency create resilience that centralized systems cannot easily undermine. As more men adopt this mindset, the aggregate effect is a quiet reshaping of demand that favors transparency and consistency over sophistication and surveillance. This is the natural consequence of clear thinking applied to changing conditions, and it reinforces the value of the paths chosen by those who prioritize autonomy and peace over participation in misaligned structures. The long term view suggests that these systems will become more integrated with smart home technologies and subscription models where your overall consumption profile influences not just retail prices, but access to services or preferential rates across providers. A single man living simply might find his data marking him as low engagement, leading to adjustments that encourage more spending or penalize perceived underutilization of the consumer economy. The sobering response is to embrace even greater minimalism or to build parallel systems of exchange that operate outside the main tracked networks whenever feasible. Men who have practiced walking away understand the power of selective participation and apply it here to protect their resources and their freedom from creeping obligations. This is not withdrawal, it is strategic positioning in a landscape that rewards awareness and punishes complacency. The human stories embedded in these trends highlight the tension between technological promise and lived experience, where convenience for some comes with cost for others that are rarely discussed openly. Men navigating the changes with calm determination provide a model for responding to broader shifts without losing sight of personal goals or descending into unproductive anger. The relaxed but direct conversation at the bar would acknowledge the absurdity of paying more for the same goods based on who you are, while emphasizing the practical steps that keep life moving forward on your own terms. This balance of acknowledgement and action is what separates effective adaptation from futile complaint, and it is the approach that has allowed many men to find satisfaction in solitude and self directed living despite the surrounding complexities. The connection to family formation and social policy is worth noting because pricing systems that favor certain household types can act as subtle incentives or disincentives for marriage and children by making single life incrementally more expensive. If single men face higher effective costs, the nudge toward pairing up or forming families becomes embedded in the marketplace, adding economic pressure to cultural messaging that already promotes those outcomes. Men who have weighed the risks and rewards of those paths and chosen independence are effectively resisting that nudge through their continued discipline, and the systems respond by tightening the economic screws in response. The truthful take is that genuine family formation should come from mutual desire and compatibility rather than engineered incentives or penalties. And when technology is used to enforce the latter, the rational choice for many remains to stay the course of self reliance. This dynamic underscores the deeper misalignments in current social structures and why the walkaway movement continues to gain traction among those who see the patterns clearly. The regulatory landscape may evolve with calls for greater transparency or limits on certain data uses, but the pace of technological deployment often outstrips the ability of rules to keep up, leaving gaps that companies exploit in the name of innovation. For men, this means the window for easy adaptation is limited, and proactive steps taken now will pay dividends as the systems become more entrenched. The authoritative advice delivered with raw honesty is to audit your current habits, identify points of data leakage, and implement changes that reduce your profile without sacrificing necessary functions. This is the kind of practical wisdom that aligns with the straightforward living many men have adopted, and it extends the benefits of that lifestyle into the new retail reality. As the conversation continues, the picture becomes sharper and the path forward more defined for those willing to face the facts without illusion. The economic models behind personalized pricing draw from behavioral economics that study how different groups respond to price changes, allowing retailers to fine tune their approaches for maximum yield. Segments perceived as less price elastic, such as single men with steady incomes, become prime candidates for testing higher rates because the data suggests they will continue buying despite increases. This is the cold logic at work, detached from individual circumstances, but applied at scale through technology that makes the application efficient and widespread. The sobering implication for men is that their stability and discipline can be turned into liabilities in the model, leading to a quiet tax on the very qualities that enable independence. Countering this requires embracing even greater flexibility in sourcing and consumption patterns, or accepting the cost as part of the price of freedom in planning finances accordingly. Either way, the clear thinking man treats it as information rather than injustice, and adjusts his strategy to maintain control over his resources and his peace. The cultural framing of these issues often avoids direct discussion of gender based pricing, preferring terms like customer segmentation or dynamic adjustment to soften the edges of what is happening. Yet the underlying data frequently incorporates gender as a strong predictor of behavior, making it a natural variable for the algorithms, even if not explicitly advertised as such. Men who have experienced the uneven application of standards in dating, employment, and law are familiar with this pattern and see the retail version as an extension of the same dynamic. The wake up call is to stop expecting neutrality from institutions that operate under incentives shaped by cultural priorities, and start building parallel resilience that does not depend on fair treatment from the main systems. This is the raw truth that has guided many towards simpler lives, and it continues to serve them well as the digital landscape adds new layers of complexity and control. The storytelling of adaptation comes through in the small decisions men make daily to navigate the changing environment, whether that means stocking up during sales periods that are still predictable, or choosing independent retailers that have not yet adopted the full suite of tracking technologies. These choices accumulate into a lifestyle that maintains dignity and control despite the surrounding shifts, and they reflect the same mindset that leads to walking away from misaligned relationships or expectations. The relaxed conversation would acknowledge the hassle while emphasizing the satisfaction that comes from staying ahead of the curve through awareness and action. This is the authoritative but grounded perspective that cuts through the noise and keeps the focus on what actually works for the individual rather than what the system prefers. The integration with payment systems and loyalty programs adds another vector for profiling, because linking purchases to accounts creates a continuous record that can be analyzed for patterns and used to refine pricing strategies over time. A man who pays cash and avoids apps disrupts that record, making it harder for the system to build a complete picture and adjust accordingly. This small act of resistance through privacy preservation aligns with the broader strategy of reducing visibility and dependency, allowing life to proceed with less interference from external algorithms. The sobering reality is that in a world of increasing data integration, such small acts become important defenses for autonomy, and men who have practiced self reliance are well positioned to implement them effectively without feeling overwhelmed or defeated by the scale of the changes. The broader economic context of slowing growth and shifting demographics creates pressure on retailers to find new sources of revenue and efficiency, leading to greater reliance on these personalized tools as a way to squeeze more from existing customer bases. Single independent men represent a growing segment whose habits challenge traditional consumption models, and the systems respond by treating them as opportunities for optimization rather than valued participants on equal terms. The truthful response is to accept this reality and continue building lives that are not defined by consumption or contribution to those models, but by internal standards and controllable outcomes. This is the path that has brought peace to many, and it remains viable even as the external environment grows more sophisticated in its attempts to influence behavior. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable, and men who have already navigated significant cultural shifts in dating and social expectations bring that capacity to the retail domain, treating the new pricing realities as another puzzle to solve rather than an insurmountable barrier. The relaxed but direct tone of honest conversation highlights the absurdity of the situation while focusing on the practical steps that keep life moving forward without unnecessary drama. This balance prevents the changes from dominating one's mindset, allowing the focus to remain on the positive aspects of independence and self directed living that make the walkaway choice worthwhile, despite the added frictions. The long term societal outcome may include a bifurcation of consumer experiences where those who accept full tracking and personalization receive tailored benefits, while those who limit engagement face higher base costs or reduced options. For men committed to privacy and autonomy, this bifurcation reinforces the value of their choices by making the tracked path less appealing, even if it offers short term conveniences. The authoritative take is that true freedom in the current environment requires accepting some trade offs and optimizing around them rather than seeking perfect neutrality that no longer exists in major systems. This perspective keeps the mind clear and the actions focused on sustainable habits that support a life of comfort and control on personal terms. The connection to larger trends in digital governance is evident as governments and corporations collaborate on frameworks that normalize identity verification and behavioral monitoring across domains from retail to online access to travel. The same infrastructure that enables personalized pricing can support compliance scoring or access controls, making deviation from approved patterns more costly or inconvenient across the board. Men who value free thought and independent living see this convergence as a warning to maintain low profiles and strong internal resources that cannot be easily influenced or restricted. The sobering truth is that speech and behavior are increasingly linked to practical outcomes through these systems, creating incentives for self censorship that extend far beyond the moment of purchase. Responding with continued commitment to personal standards and reduced dependency preserves the space for authentic living, even as the net tightens. The economic incentives for companies are clear higher margins through precise extraction and better customer retention through tailored experiences. But the societal costs include eroded trust and increased cynicism when people sense the game is rigged in subtle ways. Men who have walked away from other rigged dynamics are less prone to shock and more likely to adapt quietly, building lives that thrive outside the main currents of obligation and expectation. This is the raw power of the philosophy. It turns potential disadvantages into opportunities for greater self mastery and peace. The wake up call delivered with straightforward authority is to see the changes for what they are and respond with the same clear thinking that has guided effective decisions in other areas of life. The practical strategies for navigating the new retail landscape include timing shopping trips to off peak hours when surge elements may be less active, or focusing on bulk purchases of non perishable goods that reduce frequency of exposure to the systems. These tactics are simple but effective when combined with the discipline of sticking to a pre planned list and avoiding the temptation of algorithmically placed promotions. Men practicing this approach find that the extra effort pays off in preserved resources and maintained autonomy, keeping the focus on long term stability rather than short term convenience. The relaxed conversation at the bar would frame it as common sense in an uncommon environment where staying sharp is the price of freedom. The cultural stories of women facing loneliness and financial strain after years of prioritizing other goals parallel the experiences of men dealing with their own set of pressures. But the responses differ in ways that highlight the misalignments. Calls for more support or systemic changes often translate into mechanisms that increase the load on independent men, while the men themselves choose to double down on self reliance as the more reliable path. The digital pricing systems add another chapter to this story by embedding the dynamic into the marketplace, making the choice to walk away even more rational for those who calculate the full costs and benefits. The truthful assessment is that sustainable solutions require honest dialogue about trade offs on all sides rather than technological workarounds that obscure the underlying issues. The technological arms race among retailers will likely lead to more advanced features such as augmented reality overlays or personalized recommendations delivered through store apps that further integrate the shopping experience with individual profiles. For men who limit app usage and data sharing, this means the physical store becomes the primary point of interaction, and strategies for minimizing tracking there become even more important. The authoritative but raw truth is that maintaining control requires consistent effort in small areas that add up to significant protection over time. This is the mindset that has served many well in building lives of quiet satisfaction, and it applies directly to the evolving retail reality. The societal push toward greater equity through various mechanisms, including pricing adjustments, risks, creating new resentments when the adjustments feel one sided or opaque. Men who experience the effects directly are likely to respond with further disengagement from systems that treat them as adjustable resources rather than equal participants. This disengagement is not dramatic, but steady, and it contributes to the broader movement towards self focused living that prioritizes personal peace over collective balancing acts. The sobering wake up call is that technology amplifies human tendencies, and when those tendencies include uneven treatment, the rational choice for many is to step back and build independently. The storytelling of resilience comes through in the continued commitment to disciplined living despite the added variables introduced by digital systems. Men who maintain their routines of frugality and self care demonstrate that external changes do not have to dictate internal peace, and that awareness paired with action keeps the upper hand. The relaxed yet authoritative tone acknowledges the challenge while emphasizing the rewards of staying the course with clear eyes and steady hands. This is the conversation that cuts through the noise and keeps the focus on what matters for a life well lived on your own terms. The integration of these retail technologies with broader data ecosystems means that information from one domain can influence another, creating compound effects that are hard to trace but real in their impact. A man whose retail profile indicates high independence might see correlated adjustments in other services if data is shared or modeled similarly across industries. The straightforward response is to compartmentalize where possible and reduce the points of connection that allow such compounding. This practical approach aligns with the walk-away philosophy by limiting exposure and, and maximizing control over what can be controlled. The economic reality of the moment is that inflation and cost of living pressures affect everyone, but the responses through technology often target certain segments for heavier lifting in the name of overall stability. Men who have avoided high risk lifestyles are capable of absorbing some of those pressures, but the cumulative effect can still erode the benefits of their discipline if not managed carefully. The wake up call is to treat every new system as a potential cost center and plan accordingly with buffers and alternatives that preserve the core of independent living. The cultural narrative that frames independence as problematic for men while celebrating it for women creates the backdrop against which these pricing systems operate, making differential treatment feel like a natural extension of existing priorities. The raw truth is that human nature seeks balance, and when artificial mechanisms disrupt that balance, the response is often withdrawal until conditions improve or new paths emerge. Men practicing the walk away have found those new paths in simplicity and self direction, and the digital changes only strengthen the case for staying on them. The long term adaptation for individuals will likely involve a mix of selective engagement with mainstream systems and development of alternative networks that operate on more transparent or fixed terms. For men, this means cultivating skills, relationships, and resources that reduce reliance on the optimized consumer economy. The authoritative perspective is that this mixed approach offers the best chance for maintaining freedom in a world of increasing integration and control. This is the sober assessment that guides effective action without illusion or despair. The human element remains central as people navigate these changes with varying levels of awareness. And the men who see the patterns early have the advantage of time to adjust and strengthen their positions. The conversation, like friends at the bar, would mix honest acknowledgement of the frustrations with practical advice for moving forward, keeping the tone direct but not overwhelmed. This balance is what allows the message to land and the actions to follow with clarity and purpose. The connection to the wider world of digital control is that retail is just one front in a larger shift toward verifiable identities and behavioral management that affects commerce communication and daily access. Men who value their autonomy are right to see the retail changes as part of that larger picture and to respond with strategies that limit their participation in the tracked economy where possible. The sobering truth is that freedom requires ongoing vigilance and the willingness to make choices that prioritize long term independence over short term ease. The economic models will continue to evolve as more data becomes available, allowing finer tuning of pricing strategies that balance revenue with customer retention across different segments. For single independent men, this evolution may mean continued testing of tolerance levels as the systems learn what adjustments maintain purchasing without triggering defection. The clear response is to remain flexible and disciplined, refusing to let the testing dictate lifestyle or spending beyond necessary levels. This keeps the power with the individual rather than ceding it to the algorithm. The cultural stories of adaptation and resilience among men provide quiet inspiration for others facing similar pressures, demonstrating that clear thinking and steady action can preserve peace even as the environment shifts. The relaxed, authoritative tone would celebrate that resilience without exaggeration, emphasizing the simple satisfaction that comes from living true to your own standards. This is the message that resonates because it is grounded in observable reality rather than hype or denial. The technological features will likely expand to include more interactive elements, such as personalized digital assistants in stores or app based guidance that further embeds profiling into the shopping flow. Men who opt out of those features by using basic modes or avoiding apps maintain a layer of separation that limits data generation and preserves autonomy. The straightforward strategy is to choose the least tracked options whenever available, turning the system's complexity into an advantage for those who keep things simple. The societal impact of normalized surveillance pricing includes a gradual acceptance of differential treatment as part of modern life, with the risk that fairness becomes defined by outcomes rather than equal rules. Men who have experienced the limits of that definition in other areas are likely to respond with continued emphasis on personal standards and self reliance rather than seeking validation from systems that operate on different logic. The wake up call is to build life on foundations that do not depend on external fairness, but on internal strength and clear priorities. The storytelling continues as men share observations and strategies in informal settings, reinforcing the collective awareness that helps everyone navigate the changes more effectively. The bar conversation style keeps it real, acknowledging the quirks of the new systems while focusing on what works for maintaining control and peace. This is the raw but professional approach that delivers the truth without unnecessary heat, allowing the message to spread through honest exchange. The integration with financial systems means that shopping data can influence credit or insurance models if shared, creating additional layers of consequence for spending patterns that deviate from norms. A man living lean might be viewed as low risk in some contexts, but under consuming in others, leading to mixed signals across the data ecosystem. The practical response is to keep financial and consumption habits compartmentalized where possible, reducing the risk of compound effects. This aligns with the discipline that has served many men well in their walkaway journeys. The economic pressures from global shifts and domestic policies create the backdrop for these innovations as retailers seek ways to maintain margins amid uncertainty. The targeting of stable segments for higher extraction is a logical outcome of those pressures. And men who recognize it can plan their finances with that in mind, building buffers that absorb the variations without stress. The sobering truth is that self reliance includes preparing for uneven treatment, and the men who do so early maintain the upper hand in preserving their resources and their freedom. The cultural framing that emphasizes equity through adjustment rather than equal opportunity sets the stage for these systems to operate with less pushback, making the quiet tax on independence feel like a natural correction. The raw observation is that such framing ignores the diversity of individual choices and the legitimate reasons many men have for opting out of traditional roles. The wake up call is to judge systems by their actual effects on personal autonomy rather than by the intentions claimed for them. The long term view for men committed to the path is one of continued adaptation and strengthening of internal resources that remain beyond the reach of external algorithms and pricing models. This is the authoritative but grounded perspective that sees the challenges as real but not decisive for those who stay clear headed and disciplined. The conversation at the bar would end on that note of realistic optimism: the changes are here, but so is the ability to navigate them effectively when you keep your eyes open and your priorities straight. The human capacity to find satisfaction in simplicity shines through even as the external world adds layers of complexity, and the men who have embraced that simplicity are living proof that peace is possible despite the surrounding shifts. The relaxed tone acknowledges the effort required while celebrating the rewards that come from staying true to a straightforward way of living. This is the truth that cuts through the noise and keeps the focus on what matters most for a life of quiet strength and self directed purpose. The final stretch of this reality brings into focus how the quiet rollout of electronic shelf labels across thousands of stores by the end of 2026 creates the perfect infrastructure for turning every grocery aisle into a live experiment in behavioral economics where algorithms test the limits of what different shoppers will tolerate before changing their habits. With Walmart pushing full deployment and Kroger having tested similar setups for years, the stage is set for prices that fluctuate not only with supply and demand, but with the invisible profile built from your movements, your past buys, and the data trails that follow you from other parts of life. A man who has kept his spending tight and avoided flashy consumption might find the system interpreting that restraint as room to push margins higher because the models assume he has the buffer to absorb it without immediate complaint. This is the cold calculation at work where discipline becomes a signal for extraction rather than a virtue rewarded with lower costs. The straightforward truth is that the same technologies sold as efficiency and better inventory control opens the door to a marketplace where your gender, your marital status, and your lifestyle choices quietly influence the final total at checkout in ways that feel personal, even when the company claims everything is neutral and data driven. Once these systems link up with broader digital identity efforts, the line between your online actions and your offline purchases blurs completely. Age verification pushed as a shield for younger users becomes the entry point for tying real world identities to every transaction and every search, creating a unified record that companies and institutions can draw from when setting terms for access or cost. What starts as a simple scan to confirm you are who you say you are expands into a profile that can adjust the price of milk or meat based on patterns that include your browsing history or your level of engagement with certain topics. Men who have stepped back from the constant pressure of modern expectations and chosen lives of quiet independence suddenly find their low profile working against them because the algorithms flag lower social integration as a factor that justifies different handling. The sobering part is how this convergence makes opting out feel like swimming upstream against a current designed to pull everyone into the same monitored flow where deviation carries a quiet premium in both money and convenience. The raw reality is that speech, thought, and spending become interconnected when every click and every cart item feeds the same machine, and many men are already adjusting by keeping their digital footprints minimal and their real world routines simple enough to avoid drawing extra attention or extra costs. The economic math behind the shift reveals why single men living below their means often end up on the receiving end of higher effective pricing, even if the base tags look the same across the board. Aggregate data fed into these models shows that households with multiple incomes or family structures respond differently to promotions and surges compared to the guy who buys steady amounts of the same staples week after week without chasing deals or bundling for larger savings. The algorithm learns that the independent man represents a stable revenue stream that can handle incremental increases without switching stores or cutting volume, so the system tests those increases during peak times or on high margin items. Over the course of a year, that 15% surge during busy hours or that extra few cents on protein adds up to real money pulled from the budget of a man who has already optimized every other part of his life to maintain freedom and comfort. This is not random market fluctuation. It is deliberate optimization that treats certain customer segments as adjustable variables rather than equal participants. And the men who have walked away from traditional provider roles are precisely the segment that stands out in the data as capable of carrying more of the load without immediate backlash. The wake up call lands hard here because static planning no longer works when the ground under your feet can shift based on who the camera or the phone ping says you are at that exact moment. Women facing the hard edge of financial reality after years of embracing full independence add another layer to the picture as their struggles with rising costs and shrinking options create pressure for solutions that often circle back to expecting adjustments from the broader system, including men who have already stepped back. The collapse of easy assumptions about career success covering all bases leaves many in their 30s and beyond dealing with loneliness and tightened budgets that no amount of past empowerment slogans can fix. And the response from some corners is to look for ways to redistribute the strain rather than fully own the trade offs that came with those choices. Digital pricing systems fit neatly into that response by enabling subtle shifts that can favor segments experiencing hardship while quietly loading more onto those whose profiles suggest greater capacity or less vocal resistance. Men who have calculated the full picture and decided that solitude offers clearer returns are not blind to these struggles, but they recognize that stepping back into old roles under new economic pressures would only repeat the same imbalances that led to the walkaway in the first place. The truthful assessment is that real balance cannot be engineered through algorithms or policy nudges. It has to emerge from honest recalibration on all sides. And when that honesty is missing, the rational move for many men remains protecting their own position with discipline and distance. The infrastructure for these changes builds on hardware that already includes capabilities for facial analysis and real time customer identification, allowing stores to match faces to profiles without requiring any app or loyalty card. What looks like a simple electronic tag on the shelf carries the potential to trigger different pricing logic the moment you stop in front of it, based on the system recognizing your patterns from previous visits or linked data sources. For the man who shops efficiently, grabs what he needs, and leaves without lingering, the data might still paint him as a low engagement customer worth testing for higher tolerance on certain categories. This level of integration turns the weekly grocery run into something closer to a personalized auction, where the house always has more information and the buyer operates with partial visibility at best. The authoritative but raw truth is that complaining about the unfairness changes little when the incentives for companies point toward greater precision in extraction. Instead, the effective path is to treat the entire retail environment as a variable to be managed through reduced frequency, smarter sourcing, and unwavering commitment to living well below the level that would make small increases painful. Men who have embraced this approach already know the satisfaction that comes from keeping control in their own hands, rather than hoping the system will suddenly decide to play fair. Broader efforts to gate online spaces with biometric checks or mandatory verification under the banner of safety create the same kind of quiet restriction that retail pricing systems introduce in the physical world. The excuse is always protection for the vulnerable, yet the outcome is a landscape where anonymous interaction fades and every action ties back to a verifiable identity that can influence access costs and opportunities across domains. Men who value the ability to think and speak without constant oversight find these developments particularly constricting because their preference for straightforward independence often puts them at odds with narratives that demand alignment or participation. The sobering connection is that once your face or your device becomes the key to both buying bread and browsing information, The space for private thought shrinks dramatically, and self censorship becomes the default survival strategy for those who want to avoid extra friction in daily life. The men walking away are not retreating into isolation out of fear. They are creating deliberate buffers that preserve room for unfiltered living, even as the world tightens its grip on visibility and compliance. The human cost of these shifts shows up in the growing sense of, of disconnection felt across society, where women in their later years express deep frustration over missed connections and unfulfilled expectations, while men report higher satisfaction in simpler routines free from the weight of mismatched demands. The loneliness that hits after the initial rush of independence fades reveals the trade offs that were downplayed for years. And the push to address it through systemic tweaks rather than personal reflection only accelerates the cycle of expectation and withdrawal. Digital tools that adjust prices based on profiles can indirectly widen that gap by making independent living incrementally more expensive for men while attempting to ease pressures for others, creating a feedback loop that encourages further disengagement from those who see the pattern. The straightforward reality is that genuine fulfillment cannot be purchased or subsidized into existence. It grows from choices that align with actual human needs. And when those choices are penalized through higher costs or restricted access, the natural response is to double down on paths that still offer peace and control. Men who have chosen that route are living the proof that solitude paired with discipline delivers returns that no algorithm can discount or devalue. The rollout timeline gives a narrow window for adaptation before the systems become the default everywhere and prices start moving in ways that static budgets cannot reliably predict. By 2026, the hardware will be in place across major chains, meaning the experiment moves from pilot stores to everyday reality for millions of shoppers. A man who has kept his expenses lean can still absorb variations, but only if he stays ahead of the curve by stocking essentials during predictable windows, avoiding loyalty traps, and treating every trip as a calculated mission rather than a casual errand. This requires the same clear headed planning that guides his overall approach to life, where every decision serves the goal of maintaining freedom without unnecessary entanglements or dependencies. The wake up call is that waiting for regulators or public backlash to slow the momentum is a gamble when the technology and the economic incentives are already aligned for acceleration. Instead, the smart play is internal preparation that turns potential disruption into just another variable managed with calm competence. The deeper integration of these retail systems with financial and behavioral data creates compound effects that reach beyond the checkout line into other areas of decision making. A profile built from consistent frugal shopping might flag a man as low risk for some services, but as underutilizing consumer pathways for others, leading to mixed signals that influence everything from credit offers to targeted messaging. Men who have walked away from high consumption lifestyles are accustomed to operating outside those pathways, and the new pricing layer simply reinforces the wisdom of that distance by adding friction to the default route. The raw truth is that true independence in this environment means accepting that mainstream systems will optimize for their own goals and building parallel habits that limit exposure while maximizing personal leverage. This is the authoritative perspective that has guided many men toward lives of quiet strength, where external pressures meet internal resilience and lose their power to dictate terms. The cultural stories of regret and recalibration among women who hit the hard limits of delayed choices parallel the experiences of men who saw the imbalances early and chose different priorities. Both sides face real pressures from economic shifts and changing social norms, yet the responses often diverge, with calls for external support on one side and strengthened self reliance on the other. Digital pricing that can subtly shift costs based on lifestyle markers becomes another tool in that divergence, making the path of independence carry an extra load for those who refuse to conform to preferred models of participation. The sobering observation is that sustainable societies thrive when incentives align with human nature rather than fighting against it. And when technology is deployed to override that alignment, the result is greater withdrawal from those who feel the mismatch most acutely. Men practicing the walk away have already made their adjustment, and the continued evolution of control mechanisms only confirms that their decision was rooted in clear eyed assessment rather than temporary frustration. The technological features will keep advancing with potential for voice interaction, gesture, recognition, or augmented overlays that make the shopping experience feel more personalized while feeding even richer data back into the models. For the man who prefers to move through the store with minimal interaction, these additions represent more opportunities for the system to build its profile and adjust accordingly. The practical counter is to keep routines basic and repeatable, choosing cash or unlinked payment methods when possible, and focusing purchases on items with stable pricing or bulk options that reduce the need for frequent visits. This approach does not eliminate the changes, but it limits their reach and preserves the mental space needed for focusing on what actually builds long term security and peace. The relaxed truth shared between friends is that the world will keep layering on complexity, but the man who stays anchored in simplicity and discipline keeps the upper hand by refusing to let every new feature dictate his pace or his priorities. The economic backdrop of persistent inflation and shifting labor markets creates the conditions where retailers lean harder on data tools to protect margins and maintain volume. Single men with steady but unflashy habits become attractive targets for optimization because the data suggests stability without the volatility of family driven spending spikes or cutbacks. The system can therefore test higher prices on their regular items, knowing the likelihood of continued purchase remains high. Over time, this extracts value that might otherwise have stayed in the man's pocket for his own use, whether building savings, pursuing personal interests, or simply enjoying the freedom of low overhead living. The wake up call here is direct. The marketplace is not a neutral referee, it is an active player with its own incentives, and the men who treat it as such, rather than expecting fairness, are the ones who maintain control over their resources. This mindset mirrors the same clear thinking that led to walking away from relationships that demanded more than they returned, and it continues to serve well in the face of new economic pressures. The societal push toward greater visibility and verification across all domains, from retail to online to travel, reflects a deeper desire for control dressed up as safety and efficiency. When every transaction requires some form of identification or leaves a traceable mark, the space for private experimentation and unapproved thought narrows dramatically. Men who have valued the freedom to live without constant performance or approval find this trend particularly constraining, yet they respond not with open rebellion, but with strategic minimization of their footprint. By keeping consumption predictable and minimal, by avoiding linked accounts, and by focusing energy on non tracked aspects of life, they create zones of autonomy that the systems cannot easily penetrate. The authoritative but raw assessment is that freedom today is less about fighting every new restriction and more about carving out and defending the areas that still allow for genuine self direction. This is the path that has brought tangible peace to those who commit to it fully. The human stories of adaptation continue to unfold as men navigate the changing retail landscape with the same steady discipline they apply to other parts of life. They adjust shopping times, stock up on staples during stable periods, and treat price fluctuations as information rather than personal affronts. This practical response prevents small erosions from becoming major setbacks and keeps the focus on the larger goal of living comfortably on their own terms without subsidizing outcomes they did not choose. Women dealing with their own financial and emotional realities after the independence experiment face parallel choices about recalibration, yet the cultural tendency to frame their challenges as systemic failures rather than individual trade offs only widens the gap in how each side responds. The truthful takeaway is that when external mechanisms try to bridge that gap through pricing or policy, the men who have already stepped back simply reinforce their boundaries, making the walk away not just a reaction, but a sustainable way of being in a world that keeps rewriting the rules. The long term projection points toward a consumer environment where dynamic personalized pricing becomes as normal as variable interest rates or surge fares, with the difference that it touches the basics of survival like food and household goods. Men who have built habits of extreme frugality and self sufficiency will weather this better than most because their baseline expenses are already low enough that incremental increases do not threaten their overall stability. The sobering reality is that this advantage comes precisely because they refuse to tie their security to dual incomes or high consumption patterns that the system is optimized to support and extract from. By continuing to live lean and keeping their profiles indistinct, they turn what could be a liability into a form of quiet protection that the algorithms have a harder time exploiting fully. This is the power of consistent choices compounded over time, turning potential pressure into proof that self directed living still offers the clearest route to peace, even when the external world grows more managed and monetized. The cultural narrative that celebrates certain forms of independence while quietly penalizing others through economic levers creates the backdrop against which these technologies operate. When digital systems can adjust costs based on lifestyle signals, the message sent is that some choices are more welcome than others, and the men who have chosen solitude and simplicity are receiving their share of that message in the form of higher friction. The raw but professional response is to acknowledge the signal without letting it dictate the direction, continuing instead along the path that has already delivered measurable freedom and contentment. This steady commitment is what separates those who thrive in the new environment from those who allow every new development to erode their position. The conversation between clear thinking men would recognize the absurdity of paying extra for the same bread based on unseen profiles while focusing on the simple actions that keep life moving forward without drama or dependency. The integration of retail data with larger surveillance frameworks means that patterns established in the grocery store can influence other areas, from insurance adjustments to employment screening, if the information flows through shared ecosystems. A man whose shopping data shows consistent independence and low volatility might be scored positively for stability, but negatively for engagement with preferred social or economic models, creating mixed outcomes that require ongoing navigation. The straightforward strategy remains reducing the volume of data generated in the first place by limiting tracked transactions and maintaining habits that do not feed the models with useful predictive material. Men who have practiced this reduction in other parts of life, from dating to social media are well equipped to apply it here, turning privacy preservation into another form of self reliance that pays dividends in autonomy and reduced stress. This is the authoritative truth of the moment awareness of the connections allows for deliberate choices that protect what matters most without requiring constant confrontation. The economic incentives driving the adoption of these systems are powerful enough to overcome scattered regulatory concerns or public unease because the promise of higher margins and better behavioral influence aligns directly with the pressures retailers face in a high cost environment. For men, this means the changes are likely to accelerate rather than slow, and the window for easy positioning is closing with each new store conversion. The wake up call delivered with calm intensity is to treat the current period as the time to lock in habits of extreme discipline and diversified sourcing so that when the full effects land, the impact feels like a minor adjustment rather than a major disruption. This forward looking mindset is what has allowed many men to navigate previous cultural and economic shifts successfully, and it remains the most reliable tool for handling the algorithmic pricing era that is now unfolding in plain sight. The human element that ties all of this together is the universal desire for a life that feels under personal control rather than constantly negotiated with unseen forces. Women expressing profound loneliness after years of high standards and independence highlight one side of the mismatch, while men finding satisfaction in simpler routines without the weight of provider expectations represent the other. Digital systems that adjust costs based on profiles become another arena where that mismatch plays out, making the choice to walk away feel less like avoidance and more like the only sane alignment with reality. The sobering conclusion is that when technology and culture combine to penalize independence, the response that preserves dignity is to embrace it more fully, building buffers of saving skills and mental clarity that no algorithm can easily erode. Men who have done this are not waiting for the world to change back. They are living the change they chose and finding that it still delivers the peace that more complicated paths promised but rarely delivered. The final picture that emerges is one of a society moving toward greater management of daily life through data and pricing, while a growing number of men quietly opt for the freedom that comes from lower visibility and lower dependency. The electronic shelf labels the biometric trends and the cultural pressures all point in the same direction toward tighter control and more visible outcomes. Yet the men who have walked away demonstrate that personal agency remains possible when priorities stay clear and actions stay consistent. The relaxed but authoritative truth is that the game has changed. The rules are being rewritten in real time, and the smartest move is the one that has guided effective living all along. Keep your needs simple, protect your resources, stay aware of the shifts, and continue building a life that answers to your own standards rather than external algorithms or expectations. This approach has already proven its worth for those who embraced it early, and it will continue to serve as the foundation for anyone ready to face the reality without illusion or apology. The stories of adaptation will keep unfolding as more men recognize the patterns and adjust their routines accordingly, whether by supporting smaller retailers that still operate on fixed terms or by mastering the art of bulk buying and storage that reduces exposure to weekly fluctuations. Each small decision reinforces the larger philosophy that true security comes from within rather than from hoping the system will suddenly treat everyone with perfect neutrality. Women navigating their own recalibrations after the independence era face similar choices about what to hold on to and what to release. Yet the broader culture often frames their journey differently, leading to different pressures and different proposed solutions. The raw observation is that when those solutions involve indirect extraction from men who have already opted out, the cycle of withdrawal only deepens, and the digital tools make that cycle harder to escape for those still caught in the middle. The wake up call remains steady. The path of least resistance for many clear thinking men is the one they are already on, living with discipline, enjoying the quiet rewards of self direction, and watching the larger changes from a position of hard earned independence. The technological horizon suggests even tighter integration where your shopping profile might influence not just prices, but availability of certain items or access to premium services based on loyalty scores or compliance with broader behavioral norms. For men who have kept their profiles minimal, this could mean defaulting to standard or slightly higher tiers without the discounts reserved for more engaged or family aligned customers. The practical response is to treat such tiers as irrelevant by focusing on what can be controlled outright rather than competing for algorithmic favor. This keeps the energy directed inward toward personal standards and long term resilience rather than outward toward pleasing systems that have their own unrelated goals. The authoritative but grounded perspective is that freedom in the coming years will belong to those who accept the limits of mainstream participation and build strength in the margins where visibility is lower and control is higher. Men who have practiced this for years in their personal lives are simply extending the same principle to the evolving marketplace and finding that it continues to work. The societal conversation around these issues will likely stay focused on convenience and protection, while the deeper effects on autonomy and fairness receive less attention until the impacts become too widespread to ignore. By then, the infrastructure will be deeply embedded, making reversal difficult and adaptation the primary option for most. Men who have already adapted in advance through frugality awareness and boundary setting will hold a quiet advantage, not because they fought the changes, but because they refuse to let the changes define their possibilities. The sobering truth is that human systems tend toward greater complexity and control over time, and the individuals who thrive are those who learn to navigate within that tendency without surrendering their core sense of self direction. This is the raw reality that the walk away philosophy has always pointed toward, and the current developments in retail and digital verification only make the pointer sharper and more relevant than ever. The final reinforcement of the message is that the world is building layers of management and extraction that touch every part of ordinary life, from the price of bread to the ability to speak without consequence. Yet the man who keeps his life simple, his resources guarded, and his mind clear can still carve out a space of genuine freedom. The electronic tags, the surveillance capabilities, the cultural expectations, and the economic pressures all converge to test that freedom, but they do not erase it for those willing to live with deliberate intention. The straightforward conclusion is that walking away was never about giving up. It was about refusing to subsidize a structure that no longer aligned with personal reality, and the continued evolution of that structure only validates the original choice. Men who have followed this path are not isolated or defeated. They are positioned with clarity and resilience that the managed world cannot easily touch. This is the peaceful strength that comes from facing the facts head on and acting accordingly without drama or distraction. The end of this discussion brings us full circle to the simple power of clear thinking and consistent action in the face of complex changes. The digital pricing systems, the biometric trends, and the broader shifts toward visibility and control are real, and they are accelerating, yet they do not have the final say over a life built on discipline and self-reliance. Men who have chosen to live below their means, enjoy their own company, and maintain strong boundaries have already practiced the skills needed to navigate this new landscape without losing their peace or their direction. The wake up call, delivered with calm authority, is to keep eyes open, keep habits tight, and keep building the kind of life that answers only to your own standards. The world will keep moving toward more management, but the man who refuses to be fully managed keeps the freedom that matters most. This is the truthful straight talk that cuts through the noise and leaves you with something solid to stand on, no matter how the algorithms shift or the prices change around you. To the 1 hour gang who made it all the way to the end of this, you have the kind of focus and patience that sets you apart in a world full of distraction and quick fixes. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to see more of this direct, no nonsense breakdown, then show some real support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. It keeps the engine running and the truth coming without compromise. What did you think about what we discussed here? Do you agree with the direction things are heading and how it ties into the bigger picture of men stepping back from the script? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, because the conversation matters, and hearing where your head is at helps all of us see the patterns more clearly. Like the video. If you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.